Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to talk about how do you know if your project is any good or not. Basically, the idea behind this talk is to help give everyone some tools to use qualitative and quantitative data to sort of keep their fingers on the pulse of their project. So you know if your project is good, what maybe isn't so good, and what maybe is actually pretty great, and how do you see problems before they become really massive problems, and just in general, how do you optimize and make better decisions for your project's health. So really quickly, my name's Emily Omier. This is Avi Press. He is the founder and CEO of SCARF. I am a positioning consultant, and we're going to go ahead and start. So I'm just going to start by giving you a couple of assumptions that we have as we were putting this talk together, so everyone is kind of on the same page. Not all open source projects actually need to grow their community, for example. And in fact, not all open source projects, this is sort of regrettable, but not all open source projects are launched with a clear definition of what success means. So our assumption, though, is that if you're here listening to this talk, you do have a clear reason that you want your open source project to be a success. You actually know what that success looks like, and your definition of success includes expanding the user base. It may not be obvious to everyone, but there are certainly open source projects out there that are successful even if their user base remains basically static. Also, one of our assumptions is that you care not just about your download numbers, but also about building a real community of people who are invested in your project, invested, shall we say, emotionally in making your project a success. You care about project sustainability. Perhaps you want your project to outlive your own involvement. And also, you are willing to put in some non-coding work to make all of this happen. Not only is collecting the data that we're going to talk about going to require some non-coding work, but if you're going to actually take those learnings and put it into action, that is a lot of that is going to be non-coding work as well.
Cool. So let's talk about some of the motivations for why we want to understand these things. And for those of you who have spent any amount of time maintaining an open source project, you know that the experience of that tends to bring up lots and lots of questions. A lot of them will boil down to, what is the impact of the work that I'm having? If a bug comes in, a feature request comes in, how important is that? How much time should we be spending on that? Especially for the projects where there's any kind of commercial entity in mind, it's also really important to get a pulse on, is this project commercially viable? Where are the opportunities? Where should we be spending our time? This all comes back to really the impact of your work, but that also really affects things like just how burnt out you are day to day maintaining your projects and these kinds of things. And so all of the questions that we're going to try to answer are really trying to tie back to these questions that pop up for maintainers on a day-to-day basis. And so the first part of this talk, we're going to focus on the quantitative measurements that we can focus on. And so the primary usage metrics of interest, and we're going to focus on usage here, which is ultimately what we care about when we are assessing, well, what is the impact of our work? Primary usage metrics here that we care about will include things like how big is the user base, like how many people are we actually affecting when we push out any given change? For however big that user base is, what is their actual engagement level? Are they, do they even know they're using the project? Is it something that is really top of mind for them day to day? And then even in there, what does the actual behavior look like? How are they actually using the project? What impact is it having with our users? And then of course, churn as well. This is something that is very common in a lot of other domains of software. We don't talk about it too much in the open source space as much because it is harder to track, but it's something that's really, really important if you are trying to get a pulse on this kind of thing. If people are, coming and leaving, that's not going to bode for a sustainable and really engaged community. Okay, so how can we actually measure this stuff? So when it comes to open source projects, generally, there's a whole lot of variety, but ultimately, there are a few kinds of things that really most projects should have access to. If you have docs, which you should, if you have a website, you probably should. You should have some, you should have web traffic data about how people are visiting those docs, how people are discovering you, et cetera. And we'll drill into all of these after. Download metrics can obviously be very important. They are not, the final answer that you need, but they're an important piece. Community data, of course. And then your project, if it is appropriate for it, might have access to usage telemetry, but certainly, as many of you know, is not for all projects. Okay, so when we want to answer the question, how big is your user base? If you were asking a company, like, how many monthly active users did you have? This is a very trivial question to answer. Table stakes for this kind of evaluation, much harder here. We're used to proxies for this, so things like stars and forks and contributors. You probably get a download count from your package registry or container registry. And of course, if you have like a community Slack or Discord, you have events, you put out surveys, you will get these kinds of things. But unfortunately, all of these approaches have issues. We tend to talk a lot about GitHub stars, but at the end of the day, people being interested in the project and thinking it's cool and starring it is not usage. Contributions that you get are very high signal for this, but that's really only the tip of the iceberg as well. Downloads as well can be very noisy. You get these repeated downloads, you get bots. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that doesn't really tell you, what you actually are trying to answer with this question of how many people use this. And it's the same thing with community spaces. There's so much usage in open source where people are just never going to talk to you. We use, in any given project, use thousands and thousands of open source dependencies. There's no way you're going to contact, the community of every single project that you might be relying on. And so, all of these things that we are used to are really not getting the whole picture. And so, one thing that we can do that will actually alleviate some of these things is to actually use distribution channels for our artifacts that actually give us more information about what usage behavior actually looks like. So distributing, some registries are better than others with this kind of data, but but download metrics can be a much better way to actually approximate these things. These registries see the number of unique IP addresses that are connecting. You see different user agents and the headers that are being downloaded. All of these things can actually give you a much better picture. And interestingly, according to data from Scarf about this with our user base, or the projects that distribute their software on Scarf's platforms, if you're looking at the total download count of, say, your Docker container or of your NPM package, we see that the unique user count from this is about 6% of the total download count, which I think some people find surprisingly low. You may see spikes in downloads that are not real. They're just a CI system that's pulling and pulling and pulling. And that's, you may feel really good to see that spike, but it doesn't actually mean that things are really happening there. So next, I think, beyond estimating the size of the user base is also the engagement of that user base. And one really neat thing that we can actually utilize download metrics for are actually to look at the version adoption over time as a way to get some information about how engaged this user base is. If you cut a new release, many users are just never, ever going to download it. And that's just kind of an unfortunate reality of this. And some users will upgrade eventually, kind of when it makes sense for them, especially if they're pinning their dependencies and being rigorous about how they upgrade. That's, if you see an amount of traffic like this, potentially production deployments of your software. You'll see some where, they get that new release right away. Probably not a production use case of your software. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And while these things are not, fully definitive about what usage looks like, over the aggregate of your project, this can actually give you a lot of insights into how people are actually engaging with the software, how it's being relied on, and how it's being used. And of course, one thing that you also see is that just some users are churned. They downloaded it, a while ago, but you're never going to see them come back. And so once so beyond the size of the user base, how engaged that user base is, you want to even go further and know information about how your software is actually getting used in practice. And one tool that we all have, which I think is very under-leveraged right now, is that documentation and website traffic can actually tell you quite a bit. It can tell you things about where in the world is your user base, which features are actually cared about most. If you have a lot of distinct traffic to a particular page from lots of different people, maybe there's something in there that your traffic can tell you about what it is that people care about. If you see a lot of repeat visitors to certain parts of your docs, maybe that's a part of the docs that's a little bit confusing. And so having a sense of both the total amount of traffic to a given part of your docs versus the unique traffic and repeat traffic to your docs is also very information rich. Also really good for attribution. How do people find you? And that's something that's really, really important if you're trying to grow your user base and your community, is to understand, like, how do people find us? What are the right channels? Figure out what works and do more of it. And also don't do the things that are not working. Your time is very valuable, and being a maintainer can be exhausting. And so if you do have access to these kinds of download metrics, not only can we look at the version adoption for the engagement like we were talking about, but you can also go quite a lot further. Package registries, container registries, they see the platforms and architectures of the clients that are downloading the software. You again get that geographical breakdown, cloud provider information, even knowing if the download was coming from a company or an individual user is something that IP address metadata can even surface. And of course, these kinds of engagement levels. And these two things combined, these download metrics and the traffic to docs and these kinds of things can start to fit together and give you a better and better picture. Of course, it's sometimes tempting to have just full-blown usage telemetry in your open source project. Many of you know that the response to this from the community is sometimes very mixed. Whether you are a company as big as GitLab, who tried to do this and had to walk it back, whether you're an individual maintainer just catching a lot of flack for trying it yourself, it's not something that everyone can do. However, there's tons of huge projects that successfully do track usage telemetry in their applications, whatever they may look like. Like Next.js does this. There's tons of projects where they do successfully do this, and so it can be done. It just matters a lot about how you do it. Of course, though, this gives you the best picture, and so if it's something that your project can do, it's certainly something to consider. And so finally, churn, I think, is something that we have really not given a whole lot of thought in the open source space, I think, nearly as much as we should. And so it's important to think about, like, what does your user funnel look like? If you're a business commercializing open source, what does that customer funnel look like? And so most people will learn about your project, but they'll never try it out. And this is where the traffic to your docs and traffic to your artifacts can actually give you a really interesting picture. What does that conversion rate look like for your project? If someone goes to your landing page, to your README, what's the chance that they're going to go download it and try it out? Most people don't know the answer to that, but we've done studies of this within Scarf's data set, and we see a very wide range of how successful projects are in practice with these conversion rates. On the low end, we see about a 500-to-1 ratio in terms of users that look at your docs versus actually download one of your artifacts. Well, some projects are as good as 5-to-1, which is insanely good. And so if you're trying to optimize that, which I think a lot of us that are wanting to grow our community, this is a metric that's very much of interest, you need to measure these things in order to be able to have any hope of really optimizing them meaningfully. And then of course, many people, even if they download your project, maybe they just try it once and then they leave. Maybe they start to use it a bit and then they abandon it later on. But some are going to stick around. Some of them will be happy users. Some will actually start to contribute code, be a part of the community. And so to really understand what that funnel looks like is really the first very crucial piece to be able to optimize these kinds of things. To be able to experiment, to try what works, see what doesn't, and really be very effective with your time, and to really know what you don't need to do can be very important. I think doing less is always a good thing when you can. All right, I'll hand it over to Emily.
All right. So I'm going to talk about so I'm going to talk about qualitative measurements. So really this means sort of the more subjective human part of human data. And the reason that this is important is because even with like extremely robust telemetry, the kind that will really make all your users very angry, you still only get a fairly limited view of what's going on. You know, you can see what people are doing in your project, but you will never be able to see what's going on in their head. And you need to know what was going on in their head even before they started using your project in order to optimize things like your marketing efforts, to use a bad word in the open source world, your outreach efforts to attract more people to your project. So we're going to talk about sort of understanding people's motivations, their fear, their pain points, possibly how they're incentivized in their job. And those are the sorts of things that you'll get as you have conversations with people about your project. So before I dive in, it's really important to have a short conversation here about getting good qualitative data, because you can get really bad data if you talk to the wrong people, or if you are asking sort of the wrong types of questions or trying to put words into people's mouths. So the first thing is that you need to make sure you're talking to the right people. Prioritize talking to the type of person that you want more of, the type of user you want more of. So if you are hoping that more people are going to use your project in a commercial setting, do not talk to the user who's just using this as, for a side project. Talk to the person who is clearly using this for their work. If you want people who are going to contribute code, then you want to talk to people who actually contribute code, right? That's the type of person that you want to have more of in your community. Next, you also want to look for patterns. So the key to getting qualitative data is to not have one conversation, have many conversations. And don't just take action based on one or two comments that somebody is making. But if you have 5 or 10 people who are saying the same thing more or less, that's something you need to take into account, even if it seems like it's totally out of left field. And you might think that's like a low number, 5 or 10 people, but if you're selecting those people correctly, having 10 of them, even 5 of them saying the same thing about your project, about the things that are motivating them, that is a really strong signal that it's going to be important to a wider group of people who would fit those same characteristics. The next thing is it's really important, right, to do this regularly. At the beginning of this talk, I talked about sort of keeping your pulse on your community's health. That means that you want to run these conversations with users not just once, not like a binge session where you do like 100 of these in a month, but you want to do them over time, just as you would collect data from telemetry tools over time. You want to collect qualitative data as well over time. So let's talk a little bit about, right, leading a good interview so you don't get the bad data. It can be really hard, first of all, just to ask. A lot of maintainers can feel really scared and also a little bit like worried. What if they tell me my baby is ugly? It's okay. If they say that your baby is ugly, you want to figure out like why. Is it the nose? Is it the ears? Like figure out what about your project isn't working. And this is actually really good feedback. Also, when you're making the ask for somebody to take time out of their day to talk to you, keep in mind, like this is a form of contribution to your open source project. And if you are selecting the people that you're talking to right, then they are going to be glad to make that contribution because they are invested in your project's success, right? They're people who think this project is great. They want it to be sustainable. This is a way of helping you. It is also, quite frankly, a way for them to talk about the pet feature that they really hope that you add. Doesn't mean you have to do that, but the point I'm trying to get across is just that there is something in it for them. So don't be afraid to ask them to take time to talk to you. When you're having the conversation, make sure that you're asking open-ended questions, right? They're not yes, no. Make sure that you're not asking leading questions or putting words into people's mouth. That is often really challenging, especially if you're almost like trying to test a hypothesis, or your project you see as like you're pretty opinionated about it. But it's important to keep it, as open-ended as possible. A part of doing that is making sure you don't talk too much. You don't want to talk more than 20% of the time. You want to mostly listen. If there's a silence, you want to let it hang. You want to let yourself feel really uncomfortable, let the other person feel really uncomfortable, and let the other person jump in and add more, give you more information, so that you can get even richer information. Sometimes when you let that silence hang, people will sort of go off their internal script, which can lead to really rich information about what they actually think about your project. And at the end, you'll want to ask, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Just give them a sort of a very open-ended opportunity to say whatever's on their mind. You'll probably get a list of feature requests. That's okay. File them away. If everyone has exactly the same, maybe you want to keep that in mind. But doesn't necessarily have to be added to your roadmap immediately. And then lastly, don't be afraid to look stupid. It's okay. You probably won't look stupid, but sometimes you can feel stupid when you're having these conversations, especially because you're really trying to avoid putting words in other people's mouths, which can mean asking a lot of fairly basic and clarifying questions, making sure you understand the motivation, and trying not to make assumptions. It's better to ask the clarifying questions than it is to make an erroneous assumption. Okay, and then after you have had these interviews, when you're sort of collecting your data, you want to make sure that in addition to thinking, like seeing exactly how they answered your questions, you're also reading between the lines. Like, what language were people using when they were talking about your project? How did they talk about the role that your project plays in their workflow? Do they describe it as a service? Do they describe it as a layer? These are sort of seem like subtle differences, but they can be really important for how you end up talking about your project, and optimizing for how people are finding you. You want to also figure out or just pay attention to where people seem sort of hesitant, where they seem really excited, sort of their emotions and their body language around what they're talking about. And then you also want to try to tease out what these people have in common. Even if it seems like it's not directly related to your project, you want to pay attention to these things. So an example that I've seen where this comes up is all the users of the particular project sort of considered themselves the security expert on their team. The other way to put that is like they considered all of their colleagues sort of not very security savvy, and basically like as individuals, they considered them vulnerabilities. So they had this like almost this like emotional or belief system about their situation in common that it's not directly related to the project, but it is really important information because you can speak then in your on your website and your documentation to that need of somebody who is really paranoid and needs to have a way to control their colleagues' sort of bad ways. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more like what data exactly are we trying to extract? And now that we've talked about how you're going to extract it. So you want to uncover why they started using your project, how they really use it in real life now, and what they would do if your project was magically deleted from every server, every place that it was installed. This is a thought experiment in open source, but it is an important one nonetheless. So let's start with how users discovered your project. Avi was talking about some ways that you can use quantitative methods. They're really important, but there's some things that they can't surface. So if you go to a talk at All Things Open and you learn about an amazing project, and next week you're at home and you type that project's name into Google, then that will not show up as something that was related to this conference at all. The maintainer who maybe did a talk at this conference wouldn't know that that's where that particular Google search came from. But If you talk to people and they say, oh, I heard about you at a conference, or I listened to you on a podcast, or my friend told me, that's information that can be really valuable in terms of optimizing what sort of outreach you're doing. But you also want to know, like, why? Why did they even care when they heard about your project? Why did they go searching for something like your project? Was there a trigger? What was going on in their company, in their application that made them go searching for a solution to this problem? What outcome were they expecting from this tool? What pain point were they trying to solve, and what outcome were they expecting this tool to provide? And then you also want to understand, what had you been doing beforehand to get whatever outcome it is. So, let's use the case of the person on the team who perceives all of their colleagues as being like insufficiently security focused. Maybe the thing that they were doing to get this outcome before was like sending like Slack messages to remind their colleagues to do something. Often the thing that your project is replacing is a manual process. And that's really good information for you to have, again, when you're talking about what your project does and why it's valuable. So you also, obviously, you want to know, like, what options did people consider? And was there sort of a competition between various projects, and why they chose your project over others? And then also, especially if this is in a commercial setting, you want to know who was involved in the decision. Even for something free like open source, especially if it's going to be used in a production system, especially if it's going to be used in a production system that's mission critical in any way, there's going to be multiple people involved in that decision, and understanding who is involved in the decision and what the role of each person is also really important to optimizing your growth strategy. Okay, and then the next thing you want to understand is what somebody's initial experience was like. So how was the onboarding process? What friction did you experience? What was confusing, or what wasn't? Again, you can uncover some of this by seeing like which pages on your docs are visited more frequently, like have the most number of visits per user. But that's still not going to give you as rich information as if you ask, okay, so what was hard? What exactly was hard? Why was it hard? What was the point? What was confusing? Then you want to know, like, was there an aha moment? This is called activation for product-led growth people. And if we're talking about open source-led growth or just growing your open source community, it's a lot of the same principles as product-led growth, because you want people to use your open source project. You want it to expand sort of organically. But it's really critical to understand, like, what is that moment where somebody experiences the miracle of whatever it is that your project does. The moment when they sort of feel that aha. Getting that moment right, so you can measure through quantitative data what percentage of users is actually doing that. So like the example for Dropbox is like uploading a file is the activation moment for Dropbox. You can measure what percentage of people actually upload a file, but you have to talk to people in order to understand that uploading a file is sort of the key action that is associated with somebody sticking around on this product. Same goes for an open source project. You have to talk to people to figure out what is that aha moment that is really associated with somebody getting the value out of this project that you want them to. And then once you have that information, you can measure it, which is really important for growth. And then you want to also know, to what extent did the project meet your expectations? Did it not meet expectations in a good way or in a bad way? What were the surprises? And then also, understand, if you're talking obviously to an individual who's working with others, understand how they were involved in the project's expansion throughout their team. What do they see in other people adopting it? Okay, and then next you want to understand how they're actually using it. You can get some of this through telemetry, but there are still things that would be lacking if you don't have these conversations. One thing that can be really useful is talking about how the usage of the project has changed over time. So maybe originally they only used it for one very specific feature because they found this project because of a very specific pain point that they wanted. Now they're sort of starting to discover other parts of the project and use them. You also want to know who uses it and in what capacity. A huge number of projects have different roles. Maybe you have like a manager role who sets policies, et cetera. Then you have individual contributors who use it in some way. Maybe you have like executive dashboards. But understanding, what are the roles of people in your organization? How do they interact with this project? What do they think about it? Is there any of those roles that like it more, like it less? That can be really important information as well. Obviously, you want to ask like the standard product team questions, like which features do you use heavily, which features do you never use, what would you do if that project suddenly disappeared? So going back to our sort of original question, how do you know if your project is any good? If you ask this question and someone says, I'll just use X competing project, no big deal. That's a sign that they're not really getting anything special out of your project. They don't see it as being really that unique. On the other hand, I have had these conversations with users who answer something like, I would opt for early retirement. Like I would quit my job if this project disappeared. That is a very, very good sign that your project, they see no alternative, and they're probably going to be evangelists for your project. They see it as totally critical to doing their job. And then this last question can be give you really important information for figuring out how you're going to talk about your project, which is how would you describe the project to a colleague? What words would you use? And that can get into this question of, is it a layer or a service, et cetera. Okay. So, and the next thing, I have a whole slide about weaknesses, because this is a topic that you want to make sure to address and can be a little bit scary. Sometimes if you ask what the project's weaknesses are, you will get a list of features. That's okay. It doesn't mean you have to add all of those features to your roadmap. But sometimes it'll be other things, like your community isn't super active, or it's not written in a language that my team likes. I see that one actually fairly frequently. Or, I'm having trouble explaining why this project is so cool, so my boss is giving me pushback. Those are all weaknesses. Weaknesses are really important to understand. They are not always things that you have to fix. It's just something that you have to understand about your project, because ultimately part of your goal is to figure out the situation where you're weak and the situation where you're strong, and really focus your growth efforts on people in the situation where you're really obviously strong. So that requires being self-aware about the areas that you're weak in. So yeah, just understand what people say. Don't take it personally. Okay, so now that you've gotten all of this rich information, what do you do? So the first thing that you want to do is you want to optimize your user journey. And what this means is, how do you make it easier for people to discover you? How do you make it easier for people to start using? That sounds really bad, is to start using your project. If you want people to move up the contributor ladder, how do you reduce the friction in making contributions, making code contributions, etc. So this means taking those things that are clearly working and doing more of them, taking those things that are clearly not working and doing less of them, taking the language that people are using to talk about your project and using that same language when you talk about it. It can also mean you can use the qualitative and quantitative metrics together to figure out whether or not the changes you're making are working. So, for example, Avi was talking about seeing what the ratio is between people visiting your docs and downloading your project. So you may make changes and find that your traffic to your docs declines precipitously, and yet your downloads remain the same. So that ratio has changed completely. You might think that that's actually okay. But it's a way for you to make sure that, the changes that you're making are moving you in the direction that you want to go. The next thing that you should do is optimize your roadmap. Make sure you're prioritizing the things that people value, deprioritizing the things that people don't value, and working on those features that were clearly very important to the people, both from your quantitative metrics and from your qualitative metrics. Then, of course, it's also very important to know when to say no. This applies both to the roadmap area, the feature requests, and to the outreach efforts. If you find that absolutely nobody is coming to you because of your podcast, then kill your podcast. So know when to say no. And then the last thing, you gather success stories. So especially as you're talking to people, see what stories you can share from your user base, put them on your website, make them part of your documentation so that people can see how others are being successful with your project, and hopefully they can become successful too.
Cool. So to wrap up, one of the key takeaways here is that if you are trying to assess the direction of the project, whether it is headed for success, both qualitative and quantitative metrics are really, really essential, and augment each other really, really nicely. Doing these kinds of user interviews can really help you dig into a weird trend that you're seeing in your data. Similarly, I think you can also dig in with people to maybe, contextualize what is happening in the data. If you can't explain what's going on, you need to drill in further. It's really important to be doing both, and without both of these sides, it's really tough to contextualize what you're seeing, because there's always going to be surprises that come up. I think one of the things that I find very special about open source is that you'll put stuff out there and it will be used in ways that you couldn't have possibly imagined necessarily, and that is both a very magical part of it, but also something that makes our jobs very hard. It's hard to predict what people are going to do, how they're going to use it, and what is really going to matter. And of course, I think, while community growth and the impact that we have is also very important, it's also important to take care of ourselves. Without the people working on this stuff, there's no project. And so it's really important that we really value our own time as maintainers and make sure that time is being spent effectively on the things that matter, and protecting that from wasting it on the things that are less impactful and less important. And so hopefully this inspires you to think deeply about what it is that you want to get out of your work in the open source space, what you hope to achieve, where you want your community to go and how you want it to be, and then start to take action to get there. So you can start measuring this stuff and start taking action to really optimize to get what you want. Thank you very much. Also, we both have podcasts about this kind of thing if you want to hear more about it. Sorry. The jury's still out on that. We are measuring it, and we'll get back to you. I think we can take questions if anyone has any. Going once.
More of a comment. I like this approach a lot. There's a lot of good science backing this approach of quantitative and qualitative. One thing I wanted to say, though, you said focus on people that you consider to be your core contributors. There's one other group that I think it's important to focus on, which is the people who lead the project. It's the equivalent of exit interviews at companies, which is underdone. And so in this context, the only way you're going to find out what turns people completely off to your project is to talk to people who are completely turned off by your project.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's, yeah. I was just going to say, I totally agree. I think in open source, can be super hard to find those people. And but I absolutely agree.
I can say one thing to that as
Yeah,
well.
go for it.
I think another thing that is really beneficial for this point about talking to the people who have gone away is, yeah, that's why I think measuring the churn is so important, where you can start to see what that looks like and then drill in. And that's also why I think it's very important to keep track of commercial adoption as well, because no one is going to drop a project that's not working as fast as a company will. And so if you have a good pulse on who your commercial users are, that's a really, it's a really good way to see, if they stick around, and then if they don't, to actually go chat with them. And I think to one of the points that Emily was making with these uncomfortable conversations, really these kinds of the constructive and negative feedback is really the most valuable thing. And I think I would really encourage people to prioritize those the most, because that's really where you get the best feedback about how you can make your project better. I think in my own projects, like the people who really disliked something about the project were the most the best conversations, and they're usually happy to talk to you about it. Yeah. Yeah.
See, there's lots. This is really juicy. No, I think another thing that's really can give you really good information is people who there's things that they don't really like about your project and they stick with it anyway. Because if you can figure out why they're willing to put up with all the crap that they don't like, then that's really powerful. That means that whatever thing it is that they do like about your project has to be super powerful.
Any other questions or comments? Just to repeat, the question is about how does static analysis fit into this? How does code-based scanning, and was it about scanning the code, usages of the code? Is that what you were saying? Yeah, definitely. I think in practice that's something that is very essential to do, to see how both from forks as well as how your code is getting incorporated in practice. I think it tends to be not enough on its own, I think, in terms of, there's a lot of internal uses. I mean, unless you're GPL, or depending on what the project that you're talking about is, it often is going to miss quite a lot to rely on that, but it's definitely something that I think can be very powerful. Forks as well, for sure. Personally, I have less experience with that as an approach, so I can't necessarily speak very intelligently on specific tactics for doing that. But these days, I know that between GitHub now services these kinds of stats as a project. It'll show you kind of used by, and looking through that can be very helpful, as well as SourceGraph and these other kinds of tools that can surface these kinds of things statically. In my experience, though, that view in GitHub about what your package is being used by, I've personally found that to be very noisy, but there are some very good things in there as well. But yeah, your mileage may vary.
Would you have any recommendations on tools or services that can better give the sort of visibility on indirect dependencies? So personally, the libraries and tools that I maintain, the bigger numbers for those end up coming from somebody else using my thing, and then somebody else using that thing. And when you get to any decent source of numbers, the view that you get on NPM or on GitHub tends to be rather useless because it's just noise.
Right. So to repeat the question for the stream, the question is, well, how do we get better visibility, or specific tools for getting visibility into how dependencies of our dependencies of our dependencies are using the work, how it's being repackaged and reused. It's a great question. I think in practice this tends to be a very hard thing to do. I've been refraining from plugging my own company and tools for this kind of thing, but I will say Scarf is a tool that can help with this because we track more distribution level metrics. And so when you actually can capture some of that download data of certain packages, you can kind of do that, do these kinds of lookups to see what the dependency tree of these things look like, to be able to assess that. But I think ultimately this is a very hard thing to do. Yeah, but I'm happy to chat about it after the talk as well. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that? Yeah, it's a tricky one. Anything else?
I guess on a similar note, I'm curious if there are any tools that you've seen that are good for qualitative measurement of these sort of things. I don't know if that's need to be open source specific, but
Here. Yeah, so for the stream, the question was if there's any tools for qualitative measurements. You know, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's valuable to record and transcribe. There's like otter.ai is useful for that. And yeah, there's probably some sort of like AI powered something out there that could pull insights. But you know, the truth about qualitative measurements, like the reason that we would call it qualitative is it's a little bit subjective. So it does require a human being to like listen to conversations and recognize that, you know, the person said different words, but they were basically saying the same thing. Any other questions? Uh,
I wrote down to look up community intelligence platform, because that's the term she used for the tools.
Actually, slightly different. No, like
Okay.
the community intelligence platform is like orbit.
right.
She's talking about yeah, this is one of them. Medallia and Max PDA, which are more academic tools that you can use. I looked at Medallia in that session. It's like, yeah, that looks. It's like coming out of product. Always doing it.
Yeah.
All the time. You're like, well, that's like helpful, but this person has their format of doing it, this person has their format, and there's all these, like, oh, you can paste and put it in here, and everybody can look at them at the same time, but how do you get tags? I've never used it.
They sort of help you quantify the qualitative data.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Should we wrap up?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much,
everyone.
everybody.